do is at least give you, hopefully fill out more of the picture of what can be done and why we have to move immediately to deal with this crisis, because there is a lot that we can do. Hopefully a lot of our political leaders are beginning to get a healthy case of diarrhea, not from Ebola, but from a wrenching sense that they have to, an immediate sense that they have to shoulder some responsibility now to do something for the fate of the human race, because it's now on their shoulders. What I want to do is give a little bit of background on this disease by looking at some other cases, other diseases, and basically, if we look at the whole history of mankind, horrible plagues and epidemics have been really a fact of life throughout human existence. Today in the United States and Western Europe, despite our backsliding in the last several decades, we still have the benefits of the scientific breakthroughs that have been made over the last, say, 170 years or so, which have dramatically liberated this section of humanity from the horrors which used to be everyday occurrences. I mean, simple wounds or a toothache could become a totally debilitating thing or even lead to death. Unclean water could cause epidemics of typhoid or cholera. And these things were not, the cause of these were really unknown. I mean, they were called plagues. The actual germ theory of disease didn't come into being known until, less than 200 years ago. And much less cures for the diseases. So it was not until the 1800s that we did discover, that people like Pasteur did discover the causative agents of diseases. And in some cases, vaccines were developed, and in some cases, cures. And things like the building of sewer systems was a very big deal and had a big impact in increasing life expectancy. If you look at these things from a Vernadskian perspective, what you see is the cognitive form of life of human cognition becoming more and more the dominant feature of the biosphere and pushing back the lower forms. And this is really the natural design of the biosphere, contrary to the criminal view of the oligarchy. So this is man's creative intervention, moving this process forward. And what this allows is for more and more people, not only more and more people to live, but more and more people to live longer lives and more creative lives, and to participate in this process, this ongoing process of making more discoveries, and being able to further this process of creative discoveries and keep further pushing the germs and the bugs further into the recesses. So that's the role of, at least that's part of the role of human beings in the biosphere. Now the problems arise when human beings get lazy and don't do their job. And the bigger problem is that there are some human beings, like Bertrand Russell, or Malthus, or the Queen, who consciously have deployed to crush the creativity of human beings. and to consciously promote the sickening of people and the death of people through disease. And also through deliberately keeping people impoverished. And this has been the policy of empires for centuries and even millennia. So this, as Mike was saying, our job is actually to eliminate the reservoir of empire. Now, in 1974, Lyndon LaRouche commissioned a study by a special ecological Holocaust task force, which made a forecast of the consequences to the human population and the biosphere as a whole of the economic looting policies of the IMF and the World Bank. And I want to read a few excerpts. Actually, not directly from that report, but from, this was an EIR special report in 1985, which was essentially a looking backward report at that ecological Holocaust report. I'll just read a little bit of that. It says, "We forecast at that time, given the policies then being implemented by the IMF and World Bank, to slash the food and energy consumption of the world's population, a global ecological holocaust would be the inevitable consequence. The new policies of the IMF and World Bank included the vicious triaging of certain nations and whole regions of the world, which were given the designation of the Fourth World. These Fourth World areas were written off as unworthy of any investment in economic development. Whole nations were being written off as bad credit risks and established as looting zones. At LaRouche's suggestion, the task force proceeded to investigate what the consequences would be of the IMF and World Bank applying Adolf Hitler's economic policy of primitive accumulation against the labor and capital infrastructure to the world as a whole. We warned of the specific disease pandemics and famine deaths, which today, 11 years later, are occurring. Our specific conclusions were: 1, the Holocaust would develop in successive waves of famine and disease. Ratcheting downward in a succession of exponential step functions to a final breakdown phase and into a full ecological holocaust in the period 1987 to 88. This process would undergo several phase changes, which can be approximated in a simplified form by the classic thermodynamic progression from ice to water to steam. 2, proceeding to the final breakdown period, we forecast the outbreak of a cholera epidemic in Africa. We presented a historical study of the spread of pandemic cholera in the early to mid-19th century. We predicted that in the 1980s there would be a vicious renewed outbreak of a cholera pandemic in the region of the famine-racked Sahel of Africa. Among the distinctive features of our study was the forecast that the cholera pandemic of the 1980s, unlike the one of the 19th century, would be initially centered in Africa. In the final phase of the ecological holocaust, various strains of pandemic diseases would simultaneously attack the world's flora, fauna, and it's missing a piece here, but it would be spread rapidly throughout Africa, Asia, and Ibero-America. as well as invading the advanced sector areas of North America, Europe, and Japan. So there's much more to it, but it was stressing that not only would there be pandemic diseases hitting human beings, but you would have an overall ecological collapse because of the collapse of the human economy, the collapse of agriculture, would create a collapse of the actual biosphere as a whole. You'd have diseases of trees. You'd have all kinds of collapse, which the biosphere as a whole actually depends on human activity now. And if you create pandemic diseases that collapse a huge portion of the human population, this would have a devastating impact on the biosphere as a whole. So, that was a forecast in 1974. Now, there's, I mean, you see what actually, I mean, this was written, this kind of looking back was written in 1985. This was after the AIDS epidemic had begun. This was after you had a cholera epidemic that had broken out in Africa. I mean, in fact, much of what was forecast in this 1974 report had, in fact, come about. What we're facing today is the prospect of something on a much, much bigger scale with this Ebola epidemic. What I want to do now is look at the history of some epidemics, and if you look at epidemics in the past, one thing you'll see is the frequent connection between economic collapse and actually the deliberate policies of economic looting, as in the case of the 1970s and 80s, and the collapse and the spread of the epidemics. If you take the famous case of the 14th century Black Death, the first wave of the plague hit Europe in 1347. And while most reports talk about Europe losing maybe a third of its population, some recent studies have shown that actually is an underestimate, that it may well be as much as 60% of the population of Europe was wiped out, even just in the first wave of the epidemic. But it's important to look at what happened in the preceding century. The Venice-controlled Guelph League waged wars to impose on Europe an ultra-feudalist, usurious world order, and crushed all tendencies towards establishing nation-states. And this lowered living conditions such that when extremely cold weather hit at the beginning of the 14th century, the population was already weakened and many died. A significant portion of the population died in the extreme cold. But then the continued looting policies of the Lombard, Venetian-controlled bankers ended in the bankruptcy of the major banking houses, the Lombardy banking houses, just prior to the arrival of the plague. And this created the conditions of a biologically weakened population, which was the ideal petri dish for the spread of the plague. Now, it's also notable to look at how human cognition dealt with these problems. In the case of the Black Death, a relative handful of people, forward-looking individuals, really pulled civilization out of this horror show. And I won't go into all of the horrors of the... It wasn't just the disease, but you had this irrationality, as Mike was talking about. I mean, you got a sense, I think, of what we're on the edge of here in the United States and in Europe, elsewhere around the world. I mean, this is what hit the 14th century Europe. I mean, just irrationality on a mind-boggling scale. And it was a relative handful of individuals, like Petrarch, Boccaccio, who were inspired by the works of Dante, who really came a little bit before the horrors of the Black Death. But they worked to give the lost civilization direction and counter the rampant irrationalism. And you had individuals who did have the compassion to put themselves in harm's way to care for the sick. And this was absolutely critical when people all around them were abandoning their friends, family, even children. And this, the Brothers of the Common Life was an order that was founded in the late 14th century to teach poor orphans the classics and to be moral leaders, which produced, among others, Nicholas of Cusa, the genius who was one of the key figures of the whole last 500 years. And it was this relative handful of people who really created the Renaissance that pulled civilization out of this horror show. And this is, I mean, a lot more could be said about that, but it's a good model for what, the way that those of us in this room have to be thinking of who we are today. Now I just want to go through a number of other examples of some of the horrible diseases that mankind has had to deal with. Drew is helpful enough to put a virus, a folder of viruses on the computer earlier here. So let's see. Oh yeah. This is a smallpox patient. Smallpox is really a horrible disease. It's a viral disease that attacks blood vessels, especially the skin, mouth, and throat. I won't go into all the details, but the fatality rate was historically 30%. It goes back to the days of the Egyptian pharaohs. In the late 1700s, it was killing perhaps 400,000 Europeans every year. It was especially devastating to Native Americans who had no natural immunity when Europeans first arrived. Some estimates are that up to 90% of the Aztecs and Incas were killed by smallpox and typhus, bubonic plague, and other diseases shortly after the Europeans arrived. Any guesses how many people are dying every year of smallpox today?
0.
You're right. smallpox is a success story. We have wiped it out completely. But only recently, as late as the 1960s, hundreds of thousands were still dying of smallpox. But there was a concerted effort, and it was by the World Health Organization and others. It was wiped out completely in 1977. Now this is an interesting case because we do know something about efforts to control this disease to go back all the way to 1000 BC. At least there's some evidence that as far back as 1000 BC in India, there were efforts to use powder made from scabs of people who had smallpox, and if that powder was rubbed into the skin of a person, they would contract a mild form of the disease, and that would make them immune from getting the disease in a more virulent form. Certainly it's known that by the 16th century AD, in the Ming Dynasty in China, this was a regular practice. But it wasn't without risk. Perhaps 1% more or less got the disease and died from this inoculation procedure. Cotton Mather used this procedure in Boston during an epidemic there, and there was quite a protest and freak out because of this. He was attacked for doing this, but it was an effective technique. Then there was a major breakthrough in 1796 when Edward Jenner, a British physician, discovered that immunization against smallpox could be produced using scabs from cows with a related disease called cowpox. But this imposed no risk of disease from the humans. The humans could not get cowpox. So this is what became the vaccine for smallpox. Oh yeah. Picture of Edward Jenner. And in fact, the term vaccine comes from the Latin word cow. That's the word we use today for vaccine. And the use of this spread all over the world very quickly. Actually, I made a mistake. In 1967, it was estimated there were 10 to 15 million new cases. So in only 10 years later, it was wiped out. So this shows what can be done if there is a concerted effort. Now, in the 1830s, there was a cholera epidemic. Cholera was virtually unknown. I mean, some of these diseases go way back thousands of years. Others are relatively recent. Cholera was virtually unknown until the 1800s. It originated in India. And in fact, it originated under the conditions of the British imposing brutal conditions in India. But it spread through the Middle East and Europe. When it reached Paris, 7,000 people died in 18 days. An epidemic hit, a second wave of the epidemic hit Britain in 1853. And John Snow, a physician in London, suspected that the disease was spread from contamination with vomit or fecal matter. And he discovered that there were high rates of cholera that occurred particularly around in one particular locale in London, around one water pump. as opposed to other areas. And on investigation, found out that that particular pump was contaminated by a cesspit nearby. Now this was highly, I mean this was pretty conclusive, because when they sealed off the pit and filtered the water, it stopped the infection rates. Prior to this, you had a few people like Semmelweis, who was I think he was a Hungarian doctor who was using using washing of hands for his in treating childbirth fever. This was a huge killer in the early 1800s or mid 1800s, and clean washing of hands was not something that was generally done. I mean, surgeons, even thought it was, kind of a sign of their prowess to have a dirty apron, and they didn't wash their hands. And Semmelweis, insisted on clean hands and had a much lower rate of death from childbirth, of the mothers dying in childbirth. But it wasn't until Pasteur and then Lister, Joseph Lister, Pasteur, who discovered, he made the discovery that it was yeast, actual organisms that caused fermentation. And then from them, hypothesized that it was actual organisms that led to disease. And Joseph Lister, who was a physician, started using carbolic acid to clean instruments and wash wounds, and had a much lower rate of infection in surgeries. So this was, this is all in the last 150 years or so, 170 years. And so you had these breakthroughs. And then rapidly after this, you had one breakthrough after another. Robert Koch, who was a German scientist, very rigorous in identifying specific organisms connected to specific diseases. There's a picture of him. You had identifying anthrax, rabies, strep throat, tuberculosis, diphtheria, typhoid. In many cases, the vaccines were developed. This was all in a period of, from the 1880s to the early 1900s. It was a very short span. And this combined with the building of sewer systems and separating sewage from clean water. You had an absolutely dramatic increase in lifespan. A lot of it was infant mortality rates plummeted. But you had, in 1900, the lifespan in Europe and in the United States, average lifespan at birth was around 47. By 1950, it was around 70, 75, something like that. And today it's more like 78, 80. And this is primarily because of these breakthroughs. Then you had antibiotics that were developed. I want to take one more example.
Also refrigeration.
Refrigeration, actually, that is definitely important. That's true.
That's a good one there.
One of the big killers. Hang on a second here. Okay, one of the big discoveries in the 1940s was DDT. All right, here we have a picture of DDT being applied, dusting of one of our soldiers. This was a major killer in World War I and in World War II. In World War II, we had, I mean, DDT, or, I'm sorry, typhus was a real killer in World War I and World War II. This is carried by lice, body lice. And DDT just really completely stopped the spread of typhus. And it also, I mean, in the 30 Years' War, I mean, this was around during the 30 Years' War, it killed many, many more people, probably 14 times more people than that were killed in battle in the 30 Years' War. So in 1939, the Swiss scientist Dr. Paul Muller discovered the killer, insect-killing qualities of DDT. It's actually not that. It's not that poisonous a chemical. It actually works on the malaria insect, the Anopheles mosquito, more as an irritant than. It does kill them, but it's actually very important the way it interferes with the behavior of the mosquito. Because if you spray it on houses, this is what it's done. You spray it on the walls of houses. The mosquitoes, they tend to go into the houses at dusk and land on the walls, and then go in for their dinners as people are lying in bed at night. But if it's sprayed on if the DDT is sprayed on the walls, they don't want to lie. They don't want to land on the walls. So even without ingesting the DDT, it's very effective. But the thing is, there's been this massive fraud that was carried out against DDT by, beginning with Rachel Carson's book, The Silent Spring, in 1962. DDT has never been shown to have any harmful effects on human beings, despite all the propaganda. It's also never been shown to thin birds' eggshells, or the other things that you heard. I mean, it's been an incredible campaign of propaganda, and this has happened because of the. This is the oligarchy. DDT has saved more lives than any chemical ever in history. I mean, literally, millions and millions of lives. Just to give you some figures on this, you take the nation of Sri Lanka. In the mid-40s, they averaged 2.5 to 3 million cases a year of malaria. Through the use of DDT in the 50s, by 1963, they were down to 17 cases.
You're talking about cases or deaths?
That's actual cases.
Just cases.
Yeah. I mean, it was almost wiped out. Then you had Silent Spring, and it came out in '62, and you had this massive pressure on countries to stop using DDT. And by 1970, in Sri Lanka, it was back up to 500,000 cases. In India, there were, in 1947, 75 million cases. Now, this is out of 350 million people. I mean, and this is a very debilitating disease. I mean, it really weakens people. I mean, this is a huge debilitation of a nation in terms of their economy to have this disease. I mean, it's hugely devastating. In India, by 1964, they were down to 100,000 cases. From 75 million to 100,000. And again, by 1976, India was back up to 6.5 million. And today, or by the mid-90s, India was back up to 2 million, in the range of 2 million. Now what has happened is other substitutes for DDT have been used. Sri Lanka actually is close to wiping it out again. The substitutes, malathion and other pesticides, are not as good. They're more dangerous. They're not as good for other reasons. But they still have been effective to some degree. I mean, India still has a lot of problems. I mean, Sri Lanka is very close to wiping it out. But DDT, I mean, we really were close to wiping out malaria worldwide. And it's really criminal that that's not done. I mean, today it's killing, killing probably 500,000 people a year, mostly children. So I think that's probably, I don't know, I'm going to turn over to Lena. Oh yeah, there's one of the most criminal people in the world. This is William Ruckelshaus. He was the head of the EPA who made the decision to ban DDT. And he admitted that it was not based on the scientific evidence. There had been 18 months of hearings on DDT. All the scientific experts, the testimony made clear it was not harmful to humans. He made the decision. He didn't attend the hearings. And he admitted the decision was purely political. He said so publicly. And this is what led to the deaths of countless millions of people. Okay.
Any questions for Hunter? Or we can take another.
Yeah, we can take questions at the end.
Okay. Okay, I might need to use this board. Does anybody need the stuff on the board here? Okay. So we don't have any erasers.
I'll get your eraser.
I can use this if anybody is not offended. Okay. So I'll kind of start where Hunter left off, just because some of what he covered, I had planned to cover it more specifically, which is on this matter of DDT. You have that quote, Daniel?
Yes, you want the
Okay.
quote now?
Yes, might
Okay.
as well. I don't think I like podiums since I'm a short person. So I'm going to try to confine my remarks to discussing the intent and describing the intent of the oligarchy and the effects of the oligarchy's policies on, I'm going to focus particularly on Africa for obvious reasons, you know, the Ebola and so on, but also the Caribbean and South America. This is, I put my glasses on. Daniel just reminded me, Daniel's my lovely assistant here, reminded me of this quote about DDT. And you can read what it says. And this is what LaRouche in 1974, when he put out the first, Oh, you can't read it? This is Alexander King, the co-founder of the Club of Rome, against which we founded the Club of Life. And in 1980, he says, my own doubts came when DDT was introduced for civilian use. In Guyana, within 2 years, it had almost eliminated malaria. But at the same time, the birth rate had doubled. So my chief quarrel with DDT in hindsight is that it has greatly added to the population problem. Now, it's so ironic, you want to put up the map? Because Guyana at the time that he's talking, and even now, has less than 1 million people, and only about 10% of the country is populated. The rest of it is Amazon forest. And he's complaining about population. Do we have your pointer thing?
What?
The ruler? Chuck's got a
Oh,
ruler that I forgot to get.
Okay.
Anyway, this one here, I'm offended that they haven't named it, but this is the country he's talking about, Guyana, which has got less than 1 million people living on the coast, which is below sea level, which is one of the reasons that there's a lot of stagnant water and breeds mosquitoes and so on. That's what, with less than 1 million people, he's concerned about the population size doubling. But anyway, and I'm going to go back to the matter of DDT a bit later on, because there's a real fight going on. The only country that makes DDT nowadays, by the way, is India. It's been banned. There's all kinds of some Swedish protocol, I can't remember entirely. And so countries can't use it. And as Hunter said, millions of people are still dying. Millions of people. When I was a child, I was born in Guyana, the fellows used to come by. You got that photo? The fellows used to come by every once in a while. I don't remember how often. And the fellow would have a tank on his back like that. You can't see it very well. And he would have a hose, and he would have DDT in this tank in solution, and he would go to the stagnant pools of water and the vats where people saved rainwater and so on and sprayed with DDT. And just like Hunter described, it was eradicated, really eradicated. A lot of people used to die when I was a child of it. I remember going back to Guyana, I'm trying to remember what year it was. I think it was in the 90s sometime. And going to the main public hospital, which is the only hospital at the time. And I think the figure that the nurse gave was that 40% of the patients in the hospital were malaria patients, and most of them died. And it was such a terrible thing because they don't have, there's only one hospital, and people are coming from everywhere to the one hospital, that literally people were lying on the floor, you can't walk through the corridors, writhing of malaria. Something that had been eradicated 20 years before. So when you read that quote from Alexander King, and I'm going to read you the other two relevant quotes, it'll give you an idea what we're dealing with and why we have to get Obama out, because he is an instrument of this evil oligarchy. And we have to do it fast, or as Mike described, we're not going to be around to debate it later on. So this is, listen to this one. This is Thomas Malthus. People know of the famous Malthusian idea. And he was hired by the British East India Company, which is, of course, the main financial arm of the British Empire at the time. He's writing in 1763, and remember some of the stuff that Hunter said about sanitation and so on. He says, we are bound in justice and honor formally to disdain the right of the poor to support. To this end, I should propose a regulation to be made, declaring that no child born from any marriage taking place after the expiration of a year from the date of this law, they're putting in a new law, and no illegitimate child born 2 years from that date should ever be entitled to parish assistance. The infant is, comparatively speaking, of little value to society, and others will immediately supply their place. All children who are born beyond what would be required to keep up the population to a desired level must necessarily perish unless room be made for them by the death of grown persons. Therefore, we should facilitate, instead of foolishly and vainly endeavoring to impede the operations of nature in producing this mortality. And if we dread the too frequent visitation of the horrid form of famine, we should sedulously encourage the other forms of destruction which we compel nature to use, And you know what the other forms are. We're talking about them here. Instead of recommending cleanliness to the poor, we should encourage contrary habits. In our towns, we should make the streets narrower. We should crowd more people into houses and court the return of the plague. In the country, we should build our villages near stagnant pools and particularly encourage settlement in all marshy and unwholesome situations. But above all, we should reprobate specific remedies for ravaging diseases and restrain those benevolent but much mistaken men who have thought they are doing a service to mankind by protecting schemes for the total extirpation of particular disorders. Disorders or diseases. So you get the idea. Now here's Bertrand Russell. Says he's carrying on about, this is 1946, he's writing in a book entitled Prospects for Industrial Civilization, and then again in 1951, The Impact of Science on Society. He says, quote, "The white population of the world will soon cease to increase. The Asiatic races will be longer, and the Negroes still longer, before their birth rate falls sufficiently to make their numbers stable without the help of war of pestilence." And he carries on talking about how much the population is growing, by so many a year and so on. He says, "I do not pretend that birth control is the only way in which population can be kept from increasing. There are others which one must suppose opponents to birth control would prefer. War, as I remarked a moment ago, has hitherto been disappointing in this respect. But perhaps bacteriological war may prove more effective. If a Black Death could be spread throughout the world once in every generation, survivors could procreate freely without making the world too full. There would be nothing in this to offend the consciences of the devout or to restrain the ambitions of nationalists. The state of affairs might be somewhat unpleasant, but what of it? Really high-minded people are indifferent to happiness, especially other people's." So you got the idea. There's more, and we won't go into make you too sick. But, that's who we're deployed against. When LaRouche talks about the British, and when LaRouche talks about the oligarchy. You want to put the map of Africa there? So we're in a situation where, let's go to 1974, since we've been talking about that, and 1974 is the date that they discovered, if you want to use that word, Ebola. And this is the so-called hot zone here. You see Guinea, which is where it supposedly was discovered, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. It's not a very big area, as you can see, but of course, as Mike talked about, the danger of it going eastwards, particularly into places like Nigeria and into Zaire, Kinshasa, the capital of what's now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, formerly Zaire, and so on. And what this would mean, particularly because of the population density, you've got 200 million people here, and also the fact that you've got massive, massive, massive slums. So this is what you've got. Now you want to go to Ibero-America? Just want to show people where things are, because I find that people don't know where places are anymore. Secondarily, you've got the South America, you know most of these places. You've got the Caribbean here. This is Cuba, which we'll talk about later. And this is the United States right here. And you see these other ones, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, and so on and so forth. Now, what do we have? We have a string of diseases that are all at once ravaging particularly Central America and the eastern shield there of South America, and similarly in Africa. But you've got something, ooh, let's see. You've got something called, I might need a new marker. These markers look kind of tired. Chikungunya. You've got malaria, which has come back with a vengeance. You've got yellow fever. You've got dengue. And there may be one or two others, but these are the key ones carried by this fellow right here, this mosquito. These are all mosquito-borne diseases. And what you have, Aedes aegypti mosquito. And what you have, if you put the Varimathra back up, what you have in this area here, similar to Africa, is that this area has become like Africa, although not yet, it hasn't crossed a certain threshold yet. But this area has become a reservoir for these diseases, and probably diseases that have not even been discovered or named yet. Secondly, what you have when you have humans incubating these things, one or two or three or several, is that the humans themselves become like petri dishes for new strains of the disease. And this is the process that you have going on right south here. Look at the proximity. You see where Haiti is, for example, one of the worst, I forgot to put cholera up there. Although cholera is not mosquito-borne, one of the worst situations. And of course, chikungunya is really devastating the Dominican Republic to the United States. Now, so what we have to deal with, and we have to get the population without some strange kind of conspiracy idea, is to put their mind around the fact that this is a conscious, deliberate policy by the British Empire, now being imposed through the Obama administration, on these nations, on the United States. He doesn't care about the population of the United States any more than he cares about these people. And this is why when LaRouche is almost shrill in his comments about why Obama has to be removed, like he gave a talk today, it's not just a question of this guy is crazy, we don't like this guy. When he says it's your life that's on the line. So the history, let's go a little bit. Franklin Roosevelt's intention at the end of World War II, in his fight with Churchill, as some people know, was that these former colonies, both these ones, which were all various colonies, mostly of the British, the Caribbean ones, British, French, Dutch, Portuguese, and so on, was that at the end of the war, these nations would be given their independence, and they would be developed on the model of the United States. That was, and of course, Roosevelt died. People know that didn't happen, and so on and so forth. But the incredible thing is that once the colonialists left, let's take the countries that became independent in the 60s, like Guyana and the Caribbean ones and so on. Once the colonialists left, and you can say this about Africa also because their independence didn't come until the first one in 1958, which was Ghana. So you had a whole bunch of nations that were fighting and becoming independent, primarily from the British. And the problem was that once the trappings of colonialism left, what was imposed on these countries was what we know today as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and it's a very cynical thing because Roosevelt, in setting up the Bretton Woods system at the end of, towards the end of World War II, out of which came the World Bank and the IMF, isn't that ironic? Roosevelt's intention, this thing was called the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. That was the name that was given by Roosevelt to the Bretton Woods. It came later to the World Bank. And the idea was that once these colonies became independent, that there would be two institutions that would help them to develop and industrialize on the American model. But what happened is that once Roosevelt died and Churchill got his way, these institutions became a bank, not reconstruction and development, but a bank. And this became a so-called fund. And the idea was that countries and private outfits and so on would contribute money to the fund, and the gods at the fund would decide who would get a loan, on what conditions. That's where the term conditionalities comes from. IMF conditionalities. We'll talk more about that later. And the bank was just the bank was just a bank, the World Bank. So what happened then is that the new form of colonial looting, colonialism under a new guise, came now in the form of these institutions that completely turned on its head Franklin Roosevelt's intent. And so what we had through the 70s, and again, LaRouche comes out with this study you heard Hunter go through in 1974, after, of course, 1971, Nixon decoupling the dollar from going to this floating exchange rate system, which has tremendous effects on the value of currencies with respect to the dollar. But beginning pretty much about this time, what you had is a policy of deliberate looting of these nations, a deliberate transfer of wealth, transfer of resources, obviously, everybody knew that, but transfer of wealth in the sense that whatever income institutions that they had to be sacrificed. They used the term triage before, but really sacrificed in order to continue to transfer wealth to these institutions in London and New York, and maybe a couple other places too, but primarily in London and New York. And what that meant, let me go through, because it's very sick, because the deal was that, okay, we're a bank, we're loaning you money, you've got a bad credit rating, so what are you going to do to guarantee that you're going to be able to repay this loan? Okay, you got a bad credit rating, so you got to devalue your currency by 50%. You got to devalue your currency by 80% to the guy over here, right? You got to cut spending on education. You got to cut healthcare spending. You got to pass a law that says that you're going to sterilize so many of the women at childbearing age, no kidding, by the way, and such, so that instead of having a whole bunch of new kids coming up and you have to give them education and healthcare and all this stuff, that money gets transferred to London and Wall Street. And so what you had, I'm going to try to be quick because there's a lot to cover. So what you have through this process is a situation where, as Hunter described, you reduce the human population that was already not in particularly good shape under colonialism, but had some kind of this and that, because of course if if you got all the British families here, you don't want to have too much of disease spreading because you might get it too. Because the maids are coming in to clean the house and care for your kids. You don't want the maids coming in and bringing malaria and stuff. So they had a certain vested interest in keeping some of these diseases under control, which was gone when they left. So you've got the one with the Ebola, you know. So the population, I'm skipping, but no, not that, the one with the fruit bats and stuff.
Fruit bats?
Yeah, I gave you that one, didn't I? Yeah, this one over here. This one over here at the top,
Oh, okay.
at the end. Yeah. So what you have is a population increasingly immiserated, poor, worse than poor, actually poorer than under colonialism. Worse economic conditions than under colonialism. And so you have, as I think Hunter does know, I think Mike described, you have people who go and catch the bats, go in the bush and catch the monkey, catch the whatever rodent, whatever it is, to eat to survive. And so you have, as Hunter referenced Vernadsky again, you reduce the level of a human being to the lowest part of the biosphere of eating animals, and almost like being an animal, you know, like a predator going out into the bush trying to catch something to eat. That's what they reduce the human beings to. So when you have this kind of a situation, that's kind of blurry, but you can, this is Ebola, and they're saying, they don't entirely know.
Can you make it a little bigger?
The bigger it is, the more
it's fuzzy, isn't
Oh,
it?
I see.
But you can see this is a fruit bat here, and this is a gorilla here, and I'm not sure what this is.
Hang on.
See if you can name these two here.
Chimpanzee.
Oh, chimpanzee, and a couple other things. Rats, and I don't know what this fellow is here. Huh?
Deer?
Maybe, and it seems like a longer name. But anyway, you got the idea. So that you develop a situation where, as LaRouche said in this 1974 report, not only all these diseases like malaria come back, as we described, but you get the rise of new diseases that you don't know how to deal with. Now, the intent of the oligarchy is to not do anything about it, to let people die. And as you see in the case with Obama right now, he's lying. Oh, come on, don't panic, it's hard to get, and all these things that they're saying that they don't know anything about. The intent is to let people die to reduce the population. Similarly, we go back to this DDT question. There's a fellow, you got Ramsamy there? There's a fellow, maybe one of 3 in the whole world. This guy here, this is Leslie Ramsamy, Minister of Health of Guyana. Actually, he's now Minister of Agriculture, but he's in the same fight. And he's speaking at the United Nations here, and he gave an interview to 21st Century Magazine a couple of years ago on DDT. And he describes, and he is in a knockdown, drag-out fight with the environmentalist NGOs, who say, how dare you be importing DDT from India? DDT has been banned by the Swedish such and such and such and such convention. And as he describes in the interview, this copy's around, he, as a medical doctor also, talks about, let me see if I can quote it quick without going on too long, how many lives have been saved from malaria and other things. The one that has banned DDT is called the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants. And let me see if I can find something real quick here in terms of figures. He says global leadership is needed to re-examine political positions and international regulations that have effectively banned DDT from disease control programs. These policies that specifically target DDT must themselves be eliminated. And he goes on to, a global mechanism should be established for producing and distributing DDT to prevent and control malaria, dengue, and other mosquito-borne diseases. But he had some figures here, which I can't find immediately, of how many lives were saved. Oh, here he is. He says, in my country, Guyana, in the 1940s and 50s, more than 1/3 of the patients in our hospitals and almost 20% of all deaths were due to malaria. He says, the renowned malaria scientist, George Giglioli, used DDT to stop malaria on the coast of Guyana, where almost 90% of the population lives. Now, 40 years later, from the time that fellow was there, malaria has not returned to the coast. But malaria continues to rage in the hinterland of Guyana and is likely to do so for many decades. That is unless the present move to eliminate DDT is terminated, and so on. So that, that's the basic, you get the idea. So what we've got to do in the next period, and on the conference call the other night, I addressed the question of whether we had lost our humanity. Because there used to be a time, and obviously Franklin Roosevelt is one of the good examples, and Kennedy too, where if there was a famine or a terrible disaster or a big disease outbreak or something like that, the United States would be in the lead to stop it. We would take every risk to go over there and stop it. And as far as I know, it wasn't simply some kind of selfish motivation. It might not have been entirely altruistic, but at least it came from the idea that this is part of humanity, and if we let it run wild, it's going to affect us. The problem that you have now, increasingly in the population, is this idea that of survival. We've got to survive. I've got to survive. My family's got to survive. How am I going to survive? I'm going to go to the internet and see if I can find, I heard something about if you take, 57 vitamin A pills plus 3 calcium pills and all this other stuff. Where you're getting, as part of the hysteria around Ebola, this idea that somehow we're going to save ourselves. Where, even as Mike described, we put a fence around the whole United States and keep everybody out and stop flights and everything, and we're going to survive. As opposed to the idea where you go directly into the hot zone. You've got the, give me that map, please. The hot zone we showed already in Africa. You deploy right there, and you take it on as if you're taking on a war. And you take it on, we talked about the hot zone, and you take it on because it's the question of humanity and your own humanity. You take it on as a fight, the way you took on the Manhattan Project, the way you took on putting a man on the moon, the way you took on any other thing in a crash program style. And we have to get Obama out, because if the lies don't stop, the American people are not going to rise to the level of alarm required to demand that our institutions and our government act from that standpoint. Now, this is an interesting picture. It's a little bit blurry. But that's the Cuban flag back there. And this is an arrival of 165 Cuban doctors. Cuba's only got 11 million people. 165 Cuban doctors, which is the largest batch of doctors to arrive in the hot zone, bringing stuff, as you can see, carrying it themselves, and which is the only ones that have actually put down a full, from scratch, hazmat hospital in the span of days and started treating these Ebola patients. And of course, Cuba's got a history in doing this kind of stuff. But, again, it's the question of, and I quote one of the fellows actually, one of the doctors said something like, let me see if I can find it. I'm trying to skip on things because we're running out of time. But he says something to the effect of, we're not fighting Ebola for them, he says, something like that. We're fighting Ebola for all of us, for humanity. I can't find the quote right now, but you got the idea. And so what we have to do, we are in a good situation because we pulled, in one way or another, we've pulled together this BRICS. And if you look at this BRICS picture, it's very interesting. You've got two major pharmaceutical producers here, South Africa and India, which are absolutely critical now. You remember these were the guys producing generic drugs for AIDS, and the US government tried to shut them down and bring them before the International Court and said, you can't produce cheap drugs and undercut whatever the big pharmaceutical company is at the time. But you've got that in these two fellows. And of course, you got the role of China. And then you've got Russia now that's testing a vaccine in, I think it's in Guinea, one of the 3 countries in the hot zone. And very importantly, you've got this lady, Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, the president of Argentina, who is at war with the vulture funds, which is just the, fancy cousins in 5-piece suits as opposed to 4-piece suits of the IMF. And these are the vulture funds that she's fighting are the same vulture funds that looted Congo, looted Sierra Leone in the 1990s and early 2000s, looted these countries through the same debt collection policies. And so what we have to do is we have to get Obama out, and we have to get, in doing that, recruit the United States to join the BRICS and lead it with our expertise. Lead these BRICS into the new financial system that's going to put these outfits in the dustbin of history and build a kind of credit system where these people, put the one with the ones under the mosquito net, where this is a cute picture here. You see this a mosquito net. Where this cute little girl here, can live up to being a productive human being and have the right and the opportunity to make her own unique contribution to history. That's what we have the promise in the BRICS. And that's the urgency. It's not a nice idea and they got nice policies and look, they pick up a lot of ideas from LaRouche. There's an urgency to getting the United States to join up with those nations, which are the biggest nations in the world, the most powerful. And of course, it represents more than 60% of the population of the world collectively. And get the United States in with Russia and China and India and South Africa with their capabilities, scientific capabilities, pharmaceutical capabilities, epidemiological capabilities, etc., to take on this disease as if it were a biological war and conquer it. And we can do it. And not only that we can do it, we have to do it. Now then, let me see what I'm forgetting. I'm going fast because I know it's getting late. You tell me if I forget anything, Danielle. No, just to describe, I was going to describe in a little bit more detail. They were so arrogant, these outfits here, that they developed a term that became very popular in the fancy financial literature. Maybe Shan knows it. And the term, maybe you can see it, was they called it the Africanization of, you know, whatever place, Guyana, of Central America, of Sri Lanka, whatever. They coined a word, the Africanization, meaning they're turning you into the lowest level of existence. They actually used that word in the literature. Now, one of the cynical things that they did, is just to give you an idea, because, you know, sometimes we talk about these things and we use terms like IMF conditionalities and so on and so forth, and it's not entirely real, you know, because you got these bloodless accountants, you know, who are just looking at the ledger. Well, they don't have a ledger nowadays. They got a computer screen, and you know they're looking at your credit rating and stuff like that. But you know what they wrought in this accounting sickness mentality was in these austerity, the word they use today, is, you know, massive populations with malnutrition. No secondary education. Your kid's got to get, if he goes to school, when he becomes 11 or so, he's got to quit school because now he's a little bit strong enough to go help grow some stuff or sell some chicle or do whatever it is, you know, to help bring some income into the house, to eke out an existence. And then I told you about the shutting down the hospitals, right? No drugs in the hospitals, no doctors, no nurses.
No electricity.
No electricity. I remember one time I went back to Guyana, I remember there was one doctor in the whole country, and he was a pathologist, the bacteriologist and pathologist. And no aspirin. And then, of course, also, no hygiene, because there's no soap to wash, to bathe. No shampoo, don't even worry about that. Toilet paper and these kinds of things. Because they had introduced a campaign that they called, and it sounded very nice, as these things usually do, these euphemisms.
It was sustainable.
Huh?
It was sustainable.
Well, it was sustainable, but before sustainability became the catchphrase, sustainable, they used another term which was particularly vicious, because I happened to be living in Guyana when they were doing it. They called it import substitution. Okay. Listen. Don't worry with this toothpaste. You look, the people in the country, you know, they've got a particular tree, and you just break the bark of the tree, and you use the twig to brush your teeth, which is true. The people in the country did that. It gave some froth, you know, and they use it to people who couldn't afford a toothbrush. They use it as, you know, that way. So now you got the IMF promoting the idea, you don't need soap, you don't need toothbrush, you don't need toothpaste, you don't really need electricity, you don't need DDT. Go for these mosquito nets, and as Daniel will tell you, he's been a victim of it. They don't work so well, especially since the mosquitoes like to come out in the day. They don't just come out at night. You got, did I show you? That's Daniel under the mosquito net. But they come out in the day. That's the daytime, not just the night. You can't stay in the house all day. You got to go out and do things. You got to go out and do the yard and get some vegetables, or you got to go out to work or something, and you got the mosquitoes just insane because of the banning of DDT. But this was all under this term, import substitution, whereas they drew out the sugar, as they drew out the rice, as they drew out the bauxite, or whatever were the main, primary products of these nations. Bauxite is where you get aluminum from. They drew out whatever you produced, nothing coming in, because they said, buy local, take your local stuff. You don't need all this fancy stuff from overseas. And so as they were looting the country of its resources and the population becoming more immiserated. And then one of the other vicious things that went along with this whole thing was, you know, you're not paying your debt on time. You borrowed $50, you know, million, and you paid $73. But look, you still owe $157. You know what we used to call bankers' arithmetic.
Usury.
You know, usury. You know, the more you pay, the more you owe. So, you're never going to pay. Look, you're going to have to not only say that every scrap of bauxite that you mine for the next 10 years, sign this contract, is going for export. Every bit of sugar that you make is going for export, to the point where a sugar-producing country didn't have sugar for you to put in your own coffee. I'm not kidding. Every bit of grain or rice that you make had to go for export because you had to get the foreign exchange to pay the debt. And this is what they did. This is what they called import substitution. Today they call it sustainability. Watch out for that word. They use it a lot lately, and it sounds good. And the idea was that you didn't need the trappings of colonialism in these countries to impose colonialism under a new guise and completely immiserate and destroy and depopulate these areas of the world, and I might add, in particular, the darker-skinned areas of the world. And that was the intent. And LaRouche, since 1974, has been, you know, unstinting, unwavering in exposing, denouncing what their intent is, still is, but at the same time, as you know, you see we put out, I've only put some of them up, but LaRouche exposing them, like the Global 2000 report, where it said we had to, I forget what year it came out, maybe it was 1982. The Global 2000 report came out from the Trilateral Commission, and it said we had to reduce the world's population by half by the year 2015. And it occurred to me today that we're almost in the year 2015. And then, you know, LaRouche talked about the genocide in the Great Lakes region, Rwanda, Burundi, and so on, and held a conference in Germany, actually more than one, but one particular in Germany in 1997, in which he talked about peace through development in the Great Lakes region in Africa, which now you know is starting to come to fruition with what we proposed. I didn't bring the, I think it's on the back here. With what we proposed, with, for example, just shows part of it, but this is some of the proposals, you see? This is Africa here. These are the rail lines along which you're going to build new cities. The places that we're talking about are right in here. And you can see some of the projects that we laid out years and years ago. This one might have been done
97.
about, huh?
97.
1997, okay. All this stuff. And then, of course, you know that, you know what Egypt is doing with the widening the new Suez Canal and all the incredible things that they're doing around that. So while LaRouche has been denouncing them as murderers and fascists, mass murderers and so on, LaRouche at the same time has been scientifically crafting the solutions and going out, and our movement going out and organizing for the solutions against this lunacy here. Now, many of the leaders who had the guts to fight against this stuff, many of them were assassinated, as you know. Indira Gandhi, Lumumba, a number of others were assassinated. And up to now, LaRouche, being 92 years old, is still alive, fighting against this policy and its puppets like Obama and the other puppets around, but he's the chief one, and Bush before. But at the same time, pulling together the solution represented by the BRICS nations. And so I don't want to go on too much longer. In a nutshell, that's what I wanted to say. And to warn people, as LaRouche warned people 30 years ago or more, he said, if you tolerate that these policies be imposed on these nations, the ones that we're talking about, and you sit back and do nothing and say, oh, we're comfortable here, that's not going to happen here and stuff. And LaRouche warned people that they would bring IMF conditionalities to the United States. And they are here. We're shutting our hospitals. We got Obamacare. We can't afford the medicine. We're shutting schools. Look around in many parts of just around here and you would wonder if you're in a third world country. You got squalor. You got dirt, you got broken down buildings, you got empty buildings, you got dry, empty fields, and everything else that you can imagine, that we look down our noses at these countries about. Oh, there's crazy people, they always got something going on. It's not that, hunger, it's disease, it's always something with them. Well, the point is, look around and think for a minute. IMF conditionalities are being imposed on the United States with the same cold objectivity, accountant's objectivity, that they imposed it in the third world countries. And as you know already, they've done it in Europe, in places like Greece and Spain and so on, where they're shutting down hospitals and telling them up front, you got to cut spending by 10% if you're going to get this bailout from the European fund or whatever you call it, telling Greece and Spain, ones who used to think they were developed and industrialized and Western, are being treated exactly. You got that graph with the Europeans versus the African countries? Are being treated today, Europe, and increasingly the United States, the way they treated many of these third world countries with the same cold, calculating objectivity.
We're being looted too.
That's what I'm saying. That IMF conditionalities are being imposed on the United States. And I dare say that because people in the United States in general were contemptuous of these so-called third world country or fourth world, as Hunter said they call them, were contemptuous of them. You hear the contempt today with respect to immigrants.
I don't have the graph you were looking for, but I do have this.
You know which one I'm talking about?
Yeah, we didn't use it.
Oh, okay. But look at this here. It give you an idea. These are hospital beds for 10,000 people. This is Liberia in the hot zone, you remember? Sierra Leone, Guinea, Spain, Germany, the United States. Where we're shutting, and Spain has shut down a lot of the hospitals under the austerity regime, Spain and Greece and Portugal and so on. And then these are doctors for 100,000, and you see it's negligible for Liberia and even Sierra Leone, Spain, Germany, the United States. Spain still has more doctors per capita than the United States. So that's what's going on. So anyway, that's the thing. One of the interesting things about Cuba is that they have, for quite a long time, I think pretty much since the Cuban Revolution, deployed healthcare people all over the world to poor countries. And were critical, for example, in Haiti, in really beating back the cholera epidemic after we went there and showed up with a bunch of Hollywood stars and took pictures and stuff and said we were going to send a little bit of money, and we'd sent about 30% of the money that was pledged to Haiti actually got there, after all the ballyhoo. And, but anyway, Cuba today has doctors in 66 countries.
Whoa.
And besides, trains doctors from all over the place. Like in Guyana, I don't know how many doctors we would have had. It's better now, but maybe 10 years ago, I don't know how many doctors we would have had if it weren't for Cuban doctors. Like I said, at one time there was one doctor in the whole country.
I understand that we have U.S. military forces in about 62, 70.
Yeah, okay, well, that's ironic because I was trying to find out, Hunter was asking me, why is it that Cuba has this policy? And I was trying to find out, and then I did some digging, and it turns out that this guy named Che Guevara, who was a medical doctor, and traveled around and went to what was then the Congo, and went to fight, for independence with the Congolese, but got somewhat disaffected afterwards because he thought that a number of the fighters or the leaders or something, the military guys, were kind of corrupt or in it for themselves, and he came up with this idea, which they adopted in Cuba afterwards, that rather than send military people, send doctors. Now, they didn't stick to that 100% because, of course, in the 80s, they sent military to Angola and Mozambique and these places that were the last fights for independence from colonialism. But that's been their policy. They have one of the best infectious disease control institutions in the world in Cuba. And, they've developed their own indigenous vaccines and all manner of things.
Isn't Fidel Castro, he's a medical doctor too?
Yeah, he's a medical doctor also, yes. But and like I said, they've got 11 million people, and they've got, their GDP is probably, a quarter or less, a quarter, probably at the 10% of the GDP in the United States. But they're deploying in this way. And it's not a question, I'm not interested in their ideology. It's simply a question of, it's a question of humanity. That this is what we used to do in the United States. The polio vaccine, Jonas Salk, all these other people and the efforts they made, which are now being reversed because we've gotten so silly that we're accepting environmentalism. We're accepting this idea where these fancy housewives or soccer moms don't want to vaccinate their kids. There was an article in the LA Times the other day where in some of the schools in the richer areas like Brentwood and stuff, 40% of the kids come with these waivers to be able to come to the school, public school, and they want to have the waiver they're not vaccinated and they're getting waivers to not be vaccinated.
You know what this is it's actually the oligarchy. It's the culture, because besides not having vaccines, one of the big lines that's going around right now, and we first ran into it when we were in Sweden, but it's very prevalent even in our organization, that don't worry about cleanliness conditions, because if you, drop food on the floor or whatever and you put it back on the table, or, you get dirt from the floor on your hands when you're cooking or something, it's good for people because it develops your immune system.
Oh, I see.
And
That's interesting.
it's just insidious. It's the same kind of thing, after what Hunter went through, this fight around
Sanitation, yeah.
and, it's all part of the same geometry, the environmentalist geometry. I was thinking about what you were saying about using this bark to brushing your teeth.
Mm-hmm.
They actually advertise that in health food books.
Is that so?
You can buy
I think
special
somebody
kind
can make a
of-
lot of money.
I mean, not bark, but toothpaste that's made out of that bark.
Oh, toothpaste
That's
made
supposed
out
to
of
be
wax. That
natural
is very
toothpaste
interesting.
that you use so you won't get contaminated by all the ingredients of
Yeah.
regular toothpaste.
Yeah.
It's
Well,
insane environmentalism.
Yeah, as I was saying to Hunter, somebody, they need to put some of these people, not when they come on tourism vacation, but they need to put them in one of these countries to live for a couple of months.
Yeah.
And when they get the mosquito bites and they got, you walking in your flip-flops in the mud and the water and all the other things, and you don't have refrigeration,
I know.
or the electricity goes out for several hours a day, you can't boil stuff and all this thing. Put them in there for a couple of months, it'll cure them pretty quick. Go ahead.
Quick note.
Hunter, you better come up here. Where is Hunter? Uh-huh.
Fidel Castro today
Uh-huh.
announced, even though he's no longer president, but he's still very much there, that Cuba would be very happy to work
Oh, yes.
with the United States in the global war against Ebola, despite the fact that we're adversaries.
Yeah, despite the fact that we got an embargo that's been
Right.
starving them for how
And
many
the
years?
war.
59 years?
That's it.
Been starving them out for so many years. Yeah, it was interesting. He said that our medical guys can work alongside your military guys. Because we're sending military guys and they're sending medical guys. Go ahead.
I was the beneficiary of Cuba's health system when I was there for 9 days in 2003. The refrigeration is not the best,
Yeah.
and a bunch of us came down with E. coli from bad chicken. And, we were given access to doctors so fast, and the one that I saw did for me was gave me salt water with a bacterial infection. I was better in 1 hour.
Yeah.
It was really something. Now, what you're describing here tonight is really fascist austerity.
That's exactly correct.
Looting
Yes.
/ sustainability equals
Yeah.
fascist austerity.
Yeah, but see, I try to avoid the euphemisms, or not, it's not even a euphemism. I try to avoid the names, because people throw around these terms, fascism today, not so much austerities, not
Conspiracy.
no, not even conspiracy. People throw around, I don't like you because you cursed me out on the internet, you're a fascist. Terms like fascism have been so trivialized that the actual scientific understanding, as you describe, of austerity, of what I described in terms of the flesh and bone, that's what I was trying to get across, the flesh and bone human effect. You don't get that if you just say fascist. You say, most people don't know what actually fascism is, but it's also just used as kind of a casual epithet nowadays. You see? So no, you're exactly correct. That's scientifically correct. But we got to put flesh and bones on these people. It's not just a statistic in the IMF accountant's book. While he sits up there in the best hotel in Liberia, in Freetown, in some $300, $400 a night hotel, and the Cuban guys are living in dormitories down there, and he's sitting there with his computer, and that's his contribution to fighting Ebola. I'm not kidding. So, you're right, but we've got to, you got to try to make it real for people, because unfortunately, a lot of this stuff has not been real to Americans. It's real to immigrants, that's why a lot of them are here. But a lot of it is not real to Americans.
And I have a question about Mexico.
Yeah.
Obviously, Mexico has been ravaged by this. I'd like to know who ravaged Mexico, and the Rockefeller name does come to mind.
Yeah, he was, but it's also NAFTA. Let me see if I grab that thing. We have a special report like this downstairs. It says something like,
NAFTA.
stop
Auschwitz
NAFTA
below.
something, Auschwitz below the border.
No.
right? Now, that was written around NAFTA time, 1980. How many people, if you say Auschwitz, with all the information and all the Google and this and that and all the information that people have, if you say to somebody who's 30 years old, it's an Auschwitz, they don't know what you're talking about. You know? So,
Actually, that's probably the only thing they do know.
no,
That's
I,
all you learn in school now is the Holocaust.
well, you do, but I mean, Auschwitz.
And the word Holocaust is not the right term. Genocide is
Yeah.
the right term.
Yeah.
The
Uh-huh.
Holocaust means something entirely different.
Yeah. Go ahead, Walter.
Yeah, I've talked to, people that I think are intelligent, and, it'll be, oh yeah, the population, the world population is too much. Something's got to be done, something's got to be done.
Yeah.
So I read something, about that. It was a big paper. And, one of the things they said was that, as a country develops infrastructure and all that, birth rate goes down,
Yeah.
And, of course, like with Diana,
Uh-huh.
the guy said, oh yeah, the birth rate went up twice and, whatever. So that's the problem, But this paper said, population really levels out. It's totally false. It's completely false.
Yeah.
But people intuitively accept that.
Yeah.
Just in of course, foreign countries. Oh yeah, they're too much. And I think the other issue is, like the Palestinians would be one example, but probably more so like Africa. When you have a situation like that where you're living like beasts,
Yeah.
right? And the women are probably thinking, oh, these kids could die
Yeah.
very easily. We're in a, well, they want to have more kids.
That's exactly it.
To ensure that,
No, that's
that they have
exactly it.
somebody, young supporting them in their older age.
That's exactly
So this is, it's the oligarchy just, of course, they exacerbate that.
Yeah.
And that's the, big lie. I think people are, ready to hear, hey, we are being called, and, this is all deliberate, and get away from that, the population problem.
Yeah, no, it's exactly, the thinking has been, that, yeah, you're good, expect that half of your kids, at least half of your kids, maybe 3/4 of the kids that you bear are going to die.
Yeah.
Most of the time before they're 5 years old. So you make calculations in your head. First of all, who's going to support me, the mother and the father, who many a time would only live to be 47 or whatever the life expectancy is in these places. Life expectancies have gone down tremendously in these countries. Life expectancies which were up under the IMF have collapsed, have gone back down. But yeah, the calculation is that, if I only have 2 kids, probably both of them will die. If I have 4, maybe 1 will survive. If I have 7, maybe 3 will survive. They can take care of me in my old age, which in my old age might only be 45 in some of these countries. Plus, it's also more hands to eke out an existence from some terrible, wretched, barren piece of land. You can't call it a farm or a garden even. It's like, hunter-gatherer type economy. Yeah. So so economic development and progress largely eliminated that necessity of childbearing simply to try to, see how many are going to survive to support you. Because you had better health, you could go to school and have an education, and, the country is developing, and you have more opportunities. But that's being turned on its head. Yeah, go ahead, Shan.
Yeah, I'm referring to Hunter's presentation on ecological holocaust.
Uh-huh.
To verify this statement, I would like to know whether we have any history record about viral disease which existed prior to the colonial era.
Which existed prior to the colonial era, whether there were viruses?
Yes.
You talking about it in the United States or in humanity in general? Yeah. Any viral diseases before the colonial era being 500 years ago, let's say, more or less.
See, prior to the
Viruses.
colonial era, do we have any record, any history record that the world had, viral diseases, but we are hearing only after the colonial,
Well, one thing is one thing that's interesting. I mean, we had the diseases, which it wasn't until the late 1800s that we actually knew the actual organisms that were causing these diseases. Looking back at these, I mean, in history they were all called plagues.
Yeah.
Now we can look back at evidence and have some idea of what was causing them. Some of them were viral, some were bacterial, some of them presumably were, maybe amoebic or, but the viral diseases, I mean, trying to think of like like smallpox. That's a viral disease, and that was around thousands of years ago.
Looking back on bubonic plague, was not viral.
Well, now that's
No,
an
I think that was
interesting.
a bacteriological disease, bubonic plague.
Well, this is an interesting case because I've read this paper by Bob Ingram, and he's looked into some of the stuff. The bubonic plague, that term was actually originated in the 1890s. They had a bubonic plague I think in Asia. That's where that term, it was spread by rats, by fleas on rats.
Yeah, India.
And it was stated that this was the disease of the 14th century. But there are characteristics that don't seem to match up. And it may well be that the disease of the 14th century was something different.
Yeah.
Because the disease of the bubonic plague of the 1890s, it did not spread very fast.
Yeah.
And it was spread by rats. There's significant evidence that there were not big kills of rats in Europe in the 14th century. So anyway, we don't really know. There's a lot we don't know about what really was the disease in the 14th
Because
century.
they didn't have the concept yet of viruses, and a lot of these things were not known or named. But one thing that I would say, because, and I don't know if that's where you're going, but the idea, the conspiratorial idea that all of these diseases, all or some, were created and deliberately spread as a population control weapon, so to speak. There are a lot of people that are spending a lot of time, just as it was in the case of AIDS. Was AIDS created in a lab? We got this evidence for Dietrich, Maryland, and all that stuff. And of course, obviously, that needs to be pursued, and we need to bring the people before the War Crimes Tribunal. But you can't get stuck in recriminations. You can't get stuck, and when I say recriminations, you can't get stuck in, these people did it to us, these are evil people, they had an evil intent, they did it to us, and get stuck in that, whether even as revenge or something like that.
I think this is the larger point, too, which is the real issue is imposing poverty If you impose poverty, you're gonna get some disease.
Right, but the point that I want to make is that if you get stuck in the conspiratorial view that there are these terrible evil people, which they are, and maybe they specifically created this to wipe out population, or maybe it just came up and they let it spread conveniently to wipe out population, and you could argue about that till the cows come home. Or you can also, keeping that in the back of your mind, but fighting for something new, fighting to destroy those people. And the thing that we have with this BRICS is that we can destroy this oligarchy. We can take them down. So we got to put our energies towards crafting a strategy where we can not only render the oligarchy entirely irrelevant because we've created something, you remember the BRICS picture in your mind, we've created something that's bigger than them and that's recruited most of humanity and the leadership of humanity. But it's very important to understand that because of, let's say, the laws of the universe, as Hunter described a little bit, they can't win. You have to operate from the assumption that they can't win. And if you operate from that assumption and you fight, not just you say they can't win, I don't need to do anything, they're going to lose in the long run, you know. But you fight, because if you say they can't win, we just wait till they go. Of course, we'll go with them. You know? It's this thing that LaRouche says, the oligarchy can't win, but we could lose. But the idea is that their system is doomed because it goes against natural law. As you know, there's this nice quote from Martin Luther King about how the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Maybe not as quickly as we'd like it to bend. But so what we have to do is we have to fight to insist on and reinstate those laws of the universe and bring our actions in harmony with those laws of the universe, as he described, or touched on anyway, and as Vernadsky describes, where the noosphere, where the creative capability of man is the dominating force, as opposed to the lower biotic forms, where the lower biotic forms dominate the universe and even dominate or destroy this creative capability. You see what I mean? So it's very important that we don't get stuck in the conspiracies and we need to know it. It's important to know, and we need to bring the ones that need to be tried. But we have to go to the future. And this BRICS thing that we've got, and this idea that we're fighting to bring humanity to conform to the laws of the universe. That's what we got to do. That's what gives us happiness, as opposed to just, you know, bitterness and recrimination. Yeah.
I was going to say, we have an unbelievable example of what you were just talking about. We got briefed on this morning, which is this Indian American doctor from Boston who went to Liberia, and she is the one who is blowing the whistle on that the treatments can save them now. Yeah. And you know, people may not be aware, but the top doctors in Liberia have died, you know, while treating patients. So for this woman to go right to where, you know, this is war. And when they asked her, I think our people in Boston were at the event, when they asked her why did she go to Sierra Leone in August, she was asked, why did you go there? And she said, if not me, then who? And if not now, then when?
Yeah.
She's quoting this Rabbi Hillel, who was a Jewish sort of Platonic thinker from about, I don't know, right after Christ's time. So what's the answer? The answer is you.
Yeah.
The answer, and this is what Lena was stressing on the call Thursday, is what are you going to do? You know? And LaRouche actually talked about redemption today. I heard that part of the discussion. I didn't hear it fully, but he said the American people got a chance to redeem themselves with what you were saying about the BRICS. Joining with the BRICS, fighting ferociously on this now, is actually moral redemption, you know, for what we have not done. Sin of omissions.
Yeah.
You know, last 40 years. And so I really want to strongly urge everyone to grab all the leaflets on the table and take them to your city halls.
Yeah.
Take them to your
Hit hospitals. We've got extra leaflets. Hit clinics. Hit hospitals. Hit the city council meeting. Hit any gathering with these leaflets. Just those 2 quotes on the top, even though they're abbreviated, from Bertrand Russell and who's the other
Prince
one?
Philip.
Prince Philip, yeah. I didn't even read Prince Philip talking about being a virus.
Yeah, and the other thing
shock people a bit.
The
Yeah.
other thing is we will have Debbie Freeman, who is the one who went to this Johns Hopkins seminar last Tuesday. She's a graduate of Johns Hopkins. She will be on the conference call. We're going to have one conference call for the whole country, which will be 6 o'clock Pacific time this coming Thursday. So talk to these people when you go to these places, or call them and get them on the call to talk to Dr. Freeman. And I think there was some discussion of having a national town meeting on this too.
Okay.
I don't know how far that's gone. Maybe Mike knows.
Okay. Any more questions? I saw you. I want to make sure anybody else who might have a question gets their question answered, and then we're gonna hold it up.
Personally, for my own usage and my own understanding, I cannot separate the word conspiracy from all this, but I couldn't agree with you more. Because for decades, the Patriot movement talked about it, exposed it, and didn't have an alternative to offer the masses.
See, that's the problem.
Out there. They have to be, you give them the facts, and they're going to draw their own conclusions that it is a criminal conspiracy, and then go from there.
Well, see, the problem is if they're willing to fight. Because as we found out from many of these conspirophiles, whether they be of the left, as in when we were fighting against Bush, or whether they be of the right, as now fighting against Obama, and really they're the same thing, but you know, for purposes of argument, they have all the facts. They're not willing to fight. They're still in this little comfort zone. Yeah, I know, but you know, I'm making it. I've got some money in my 401k plan. You know, I'm still working even though I have 3 part-time jobs. Right? So it's not information. I was saying this on the call the other night. A lot of these populist, conspirophile, whatever kind of groups have become impotent by having too much information.
I agree.
I mean, they can come there and talk to you and carry on and cite like a fundamentalist, citing verses, a chapter and verse of the Bible and stuff, and then you say, okay, join the fight.
Yeah,
oh, no. I got to ask my wife, or so, well, you know, whatever.
Meet and retreat.
Yeah, they become impotent because Rush Limbaugh and Hannity and I don't know who else, I can't think of all the names now, have just filled them up, and they're in the house listening to them, they're in the car listening to them, their brains are soaked with them, and they're simply spectators in a game.
That's right.
And no, we demand when we go out there and we put up our tables that they got to stand up on the stage of history and fight. And a lot of them don't have the guts to do it. So, you know, and let me tell you, some of the ones with the most information are the most impotent.
Because knowledge isn't the ultimate answer.
Yeah. my grandmother used to say, too much education, too much knowledge is a terrible thing. Too much education
Be
is
the
a
best
terrible thing.
educated slaves on the planet, huh?
Okay. All right. So thanks, everybody.
Death. A relative handful of people, forward-looking individuals, really pulled civilization out of this horror show. And I won't go into all of the horrors of the... It wasn't just the disease, but you had this irrationality, as Mike was talking about. I mean, you got a sense, I think, of what we're on the edge of here in the United States and in Europe and elsewhere around the world. I mean, this is what hit the 14th century Europe. I mean, just irrationality on a mind-boggling scale. And it was a relative handful of individuals, like Petrarch, Boccaccio, who were inspired by the works of Dante, who really came a little bit before the horrors of the Black Death. But they worked to give the lost civilization direction and counter the rampant irrationalism. And you had individuals who did have the compassion to put themselves in harm's way to care for the sick. And this was absolutely critical when people all around them were abandoning their friends, family, even children. And this, the Brothers of the Common Life was an order that was founded in the late 14th century to teach poor orphans the classics and to be moral leaders, which produced, among others, Nicholas of Cusa, the genius who was one of the key figures of the whole last 500 years. And it was this relative handful of people who really created the Renaissance that pulled civilization out of this horror show. And this is, I mean, a lot more could be said about that, but it's a good model for what, the way that those of us in this room have to be thinking of who we are today. Now I just want to go through a number of other examples of some of the horrible diseases that mankind has had to deal with. Drew is helpful enough to put a virus, a folder of viruses on the computer earlier here. So let's see. Oh yeah. This is a smallpox patient. Smallpox is really a horrible disease. It's a viral disease that attacks blood vessels, especially the skin, mouth, and throat. I won't go into all the policy of primitive accumulation against the labor and capital infrastructure to the world as a whole. We warned of the specific disease pandemics and famine deaths, which today, 11 years later, are occurring. Our specific conclusions were: 1, the Holocaust would develop in successive waves of famine and disease. Ratcheting downward in a succession of exponential step functions to a final breakdown phase and into a full ecological holocaust in the period 1987 to 88. This process would undergo several phase changes. which can be approximated in a simplified form by the classic thermodynamic progression from ice to water to steam. 2. Proceeding to the final breakdown period, we forecast the outbreak of a cholera epidemic in Africa. We presented a historical study of the spread of pandemic cholera in the early to mid-19th century. We predicted that in the 1980s there would be a vicious, renewed outbreak of a cholera pandemic in the region of the famine-racked Sahel of Africa. Among the distinctive features of our study was the forecast that the cholera pandemic of the 1980s, unlike the one of the 19th century, would be initially centered in Africa. In the final phase of the ecological holocaust, various strains of pandemic diseases would simultaneously attack the world's flora, fauna, and it's missing a piece here, but it would be spread rapidly throughout Africa, Asia, and Ibero-America, as well as invading the advanced sector areas of North America, Europe, and Japan. So there's much more to it, but it was stressing that not only would there be pandemic diseases hitting human beings, but you would have an overall ecological collapse because of the collapse of the human economy, the collapse of agriculture would create a collapse of the actual biosphere as a whole. You'd have diseases of trees. You'd have all kinds of collapse, which the biosphere as a whole actually depends on human activity now. And if you create pandemic diseases that collapse a huge portion of the human population, this would have a devastating impact on the biosphere as a whole. So, that was a forecast in 1974. Now, there's you see what actually, this was written, what this allows is for more and more people, not only more and more people to live, but more and more people to live longer lives and more creative lives, and to participate in this process, this ongoing process of making more discoveries, and being able to further this process of creative discovery and keep further pushing the germs and the bugs further into the recesses. So that's the role of, at least that's part of the role of human beings in the biosphere. Now the problems arise when human beings get lazy and don't do their job. And the bigger problem is that there are some human beings, like Bertrand Russell, or Malthus, or the Queen, who consciously have deployed to crush the creativity of human beings and to consciously promote the sickening of people and the death of people through disease, and also through deliberately keeping people impoverished. And this has been the policy of empires for centuries and even millennia. So this, as Mike was saying, our job is actually to eliminate the reservoir of empire. Now, in 1974, Lyndon LaRouche commissioned a study by a special ecological Holocaust task force, which made a forecast of the consequences to the human population and the biosphere as a whole of the economic looting policies of the IMF and the World Bank. And I want to read a few excerpts. Actually, not directly from that report, but from, this was an EIR special report in 1985, which was essentially a looking backward report at that ecological Holocaust report. I'll just read a little bit of that. It says, we forecast at that time, given the policies then being implemented by the IMF and the World Bank, to slash the food and energy consumption of the world's population, a global ecological holocaust would be the inevitable consequence. The new policies of the IMF and World Bank included the vicious triaging of certain nations and whole regions of the world, which were given the designation of the Fourth World. These Fourth World areas were written off as unworthy of any investment in economic development. Whole nations were being written off as bad credit risks and established as looting zones. At LaRouche's suggestion, the task force proceeded to investigate what the consequences would be of the IMF and World Bank applying Adolf Hitler's economic... do is at least give you, hopefully fill out more of the picture of what can be done and why we have to move immediately to deal with this crisis, because there is a lot that we can do. Hopefully a lot of our political leaders are beginning to get a healthy case of diarrhea, not from Ebola, but from a wrenching sense that they have to, an immediate sense that they have to shoulder some responsibility now to do something for the fate of the human race, because it's now on their shoulders. What I want to do is give a little bit background on this disease by looking at some other cases, other diseases, and basically, if we look at the whole history of mankind, horrible plagues and epidemics have been really a fact of life throughout human existence. Today in the United States and Western Europe, despite our backsliding in the last several decades, we still have the benefits of the scientific breakthroughs that have been made over the last, say, 170 years or so, which have dramatically liberated this section of humanity from the horrors which used to be everyday occurrences. Simple wounds or a toothache could become a totally debilitating thing or even lead to death. Unclean water could cause epidemics of typhoid or cholera. And these things were not, the cause of these were really unknown. They were called plagues. The actual germ theory of disease didn't come into being known until less than 200 years ago, and much less cures for the diseases. So it was not until the 1800s that we did discover, that people like Pasteur did discover the causative agents of diseases. And in some cases, vaccines were developed, and in some cases, cures. And things like the building of sewer systems was a very big deal, and had a big impact in increasing life expectancy. If you look at these things from a Vernadskian perspective, what you see is the cognitive form of life of human human cognition becoming more and more the dominant feature of the biosphere and pushing back the lower forms. And this is really the natural design of the biosphere, contrary to the criminal view of the oligarchy. So this is man's creative intervention, this moving this process forward. And kind of looking back, it was written 1985. This was after the AIDS epidemic had begun. This was after you had a cholera epidemic that had broken out in Africa. I mean, in fact, much of what was forecast in this 1974 report had, in fact, come about. What we're facing today is the prospect of something on a much, much bigger scale with this Ebola epidemic. What I want to do now is look at the history of some epidemics, and if you look at epidemics in the past, one thing you'll see is the frequent connection between economic collapse and the deliberate policies of economic looting, as in the case of the 1970s and 80s, and the collapse and the spread of the epidemics. If you take the famous case of the 14th century Black Death, the first wave of the plague hit Europe in 1347. And while most reports talk about Europe losing maybe a third of its population, some recent studies have shown that actually is an underestimate, that it may well be as much as 60% of the population of Europe was wiped out, even just in the first wave of the epidemic. But it's important to look at what happened in the preceding century. The Venice-controlled Guelph League waged wars to impose on Europe an ultra-feudalist, usurious world order, and crushed all tendencies towards establishing nation-states. And this lowered living conditions such that when extremely cold weather hit at the beginning of the 14th century, the population was already weakened and many died. A significant portion of the population died in the extreme cold. But then the continued looting policies of the Lombard, Venetian-controlled bankers ended in the bankruptcy of the major banking houses, the Lombardy banking houses, just prior to the arrival of the plague. And this created the conditions of a biologically weakened population, which was the ideal petri dish for the spread of the plague. Now, it's also notable to look at how human cognition dealt with these problems. In the case of the Black